following story comes from the nosleep section of Reddit, written by Darkheroxx. I saw hell in the hospital hallway. Sorry in advance for the long post. I'll be calling myself Sarah, and I work at a hospital in upstate New York as a nurse. I was originally from Pennsylvania, but just recently moved towards the Big Apple for a change of pace and scenery. I love doing my job because I genuinely love helping people. But something started happening here recently that has made me rethink my plans of staying here. There are tons of stories at the hospital I work at. There's one story of a man who was admitted one evening because he collapsed at his construction job. When a doctor came to examine him, he told the man that he would have to stay a while to run some tests. Well, time passed and he had gotten much worse. He could barely breathe and he was in immense pain. When the results finally came back, they had told the man that he had asbestosis, a condition that scars the lungs from breathing in asbestos fibers from his work. Unfortunately, that was not uncommon back then. Well, the man didn't take the news very well. He was in pain, and he didn't want to allow the disease to eat away at him any longer. It was later that night when he walked towards his door and looked to see if the hallways were empty. There was an eerie silence around him and no other signs of life in his vicinity. The man proceeded to get on his knees and place his neck on the doorframe. Using all of his strength, the man proceeded to slam the wooden door onto his neck over and over and over. Slam, 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 crack. It was an instant, and the man was in a crazed stupor as he continuously slammed the door onto his neck. Blood splattered everywhere as the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking filled the hallways. His labored breaths began to gurgle as his throat began to fill with crimson. A short time later, some nurses had found his mess of a body and their screams carried into the night. Apparently, that floor isn't used anymore, and you can still hear the door slam. I've been there, done that. I get it. It's fun to scare the newbies when they arrive, especially the ones on night shift. I'm sure this place has some history, but I doubted the existence of the supernatural wandering around the hospital. At first, when they told me about the ghost, I chuckled and brushed it off. But when my CNO, Chief Nursing Officer, insisted for me to be careful my first night, I thought I'd pretend to take it a bit more seriously. I ended up going weeks without experiencing a single thing aside from the normal crazy of just working in a hospital, especially during COVID. With the massive influx of patients following the pandemic, we had to clean up and open up every room that we had, even the previously mentioned unused floor. It was one night I was going through the halls and I had to investigate a noise. It was a weekend during the absolute craziness of the pandemic and we were all being spread thin. We all had to go to areas where we usually wouldn't go, but it was okay. We were all focused on getting these patients situated. I was taking care of an area that didn't have any COVID patients. This was the floor we recently opened up. We had a patient who we called Jack, an older gentleman who was brought in because he had some chest pains. I came into Jack's room one night and he asked me if I could give him anything to help him sleep. When he first came in a few days ago, he was extremely bright and chipper despite his condition. But tonight he was pale and shaking. That concerned me and I asked him if his chest pains were keeping him up at night, and he just looked at me with small tears forming in the corner of his eyes. He shuddered as he told me that someone keeps coming into his room at night. This was my first time hearing about anything like this, so I asked if he could tell me more. Jack downcast his eyes as he began to rub his shaking hands together. He told me that late at night, he would hear his door open and slam shut. He would wake up and see a dark figure crawling towards him. Now, I asked if it was another nurse that we had, but Jack was sure it wasn't them. Jack described the figure as a large man with short white hair. His mouth was open, and he said that blood was slowly trickling out of it. He began to shiver a bit as he continued to describe what he saw. Jack continued by telling me that the man was in an old hospital gown, but it was worn with splatters of blood on it. He began to close his eyes as he told me the man's neck was crooked and broken. The flesh on his neck was torn open to reveal shattered bone. I felt sorry for the man. I assumed that he had more issues than just chest pain, so I assured him that I would get someone to check off something that would help him. I had to make my rounds to check on other patients, but I told him I would check on him again soon. As I closed the door to his room, I could hear him quickly shuffle back onto his bed. I made my way around the hall towards the other patients. They all complained about losing sleep, not from a man visiting them at night, but the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. I talked to some other nurses about it, and their faces were in absolute shock. They didn't want to listen anymore, and told me I shouldn't be trying to scare them. I didn't know what else to do, but maybe it was just a coincidence. After forcing down a can of Red Bull and a cup of coffee, I looked at my watch. It was around 3 a.m., so I wanted to go and check on the patients. I walked towards the elevator and pressed the button to go up towards the old floor. I forced a laugh as I remembered Jack's account of the man he saw, one of the old stories about the man who killed himself, and a few other tales the nurses had told me. I didn't want to scare myself, but the description of the figure and the fear I saw in Jack's eyes, that very fear began to slowly sink into me. The elevator doors slowly creaked open and I was met with a dimly lit hallway. We had to save on power so late at night we wouldn't have all the lights on. As I walked through towards the hall, the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent lamps began to buzz as my footsteps slowly echoed through the hallway. I saw something at the end of the hall from one of the rooms. Something, was peering at me from the bottom of the hallway. Only the top of their head was visible, but I was able to make out a thin tuft of white hair atop a man's head. As the lights flicked, the flashes of light hit their faces, and I could see their eyes glow white. I could hear my breath begin to shudder as I stared towards the head, and I could hear another breath. It sounded as if someone was taking short breaths while submerged in water. The quick inhales were low, and I could hear something snap with each labored breath. I jumped as a sudden slam erupted from their direction, and suddenly another, and another. The sound of a door slamming began to echo throughout the hallway, and each time it slammed, I could hear something squish, something snap, something tear. I wanted to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Was I having some kind of waking nightmare? Has my mind conjured some sort of phantom from all those damn stories? Before I was able to let out my own, a yell could be heard down the hall from Jack's room. His cry of terror made my blood run cold as ice. Then another scream, and another scream, all coming from the other patients' rooms. The sound came rushing towards me, a dark symphony of horrified cries resonating into my skull. My legs shook, and I fell onto my knees, trying desperately to mute the sound by covering my ears. My head was ringing, and I felt blood running down my nostrils. Tears began to flood my eyes, and when I screamed, I couldn't hear anything at all. I was completely drowned in screams. I looked forward, and I saw the head slowly move out of the doorway. When it fully emerged from Jack's rooms, I could see that it was indeed in an old hospital gown. It was on the floor, propping itself up on its legs and arms. Each limb was bending in an inhuman way, like the legs of a spider, the way the joint shot up and bent downwards. The figure's head was bent, broken. It swayed back and forth as its eyes flashed light from the flickering of the light. Each time, its neck sways and it splatters dark red blood onto the walls. It was looking towards me with its mouth slack-jawed. Despite being surrounded by screams, I could faintly hear its blood-soaked inhales. It just stared at me, and I began to slowly shuffle backwards towards the elevator doors. That's when it began to step towards me. And each time it got closer, the dimming lights behind it would pop and shatter. It crept towards me, slowly, while the darkness followed behind it. I was sure I was in hell at this point, as the screams got louder, the figure creeping closer, and darkness covering the hallway. It was only a few feet away from me now. Its limbs groaned and cracked as it moved closer and closer. I'll never forget how its white eyes stayed fixed upon me as its broken neck swayed back and forth with its jaw hanging down to reveal a small flow of blood. My back was completely on the elevator door, and it was so close to me. It began to scramble over me, and its bent spider-like arms were on either side of me, and it pushed its face closer to mine. All I could see were its rotten, pale face, and behind it, a dark abyss. I couldn't hear anything more. The screams must have deafened me, but I pushed my head into the elevator door and closed my eyes tightly as it got even closer. I could feel a cold breath brush my cheek. I suddenly fell backwards and my head fell onto the floor of the elevator. I looked up to see another nurse, May, looking down at me confused. She saw that I was white as a sheet and quickly got down to examine me. Blood was trickling out of my nose and ears, and tears were gushing out of my eyes. I could barely speak. All that came out were cries. I looked towards the hallway, and it was dimly lit with all of the doors closed. May rushed me out of there and had a doctor go out of his way to look at me. I had to take a week off of work. I was a complete mess. When I finally recovered, I vowed not to speak of it again. Out of sight, out of mind. I never saw that figure again. There's whispers, of course, from the staff saying that I saw a ghost. I'm just too afraid to admit what I saw. What scares me the most is that it was just one story. There are many, many more that are echoing through this hospital, and I'm terrified to see the worst of them.